Good morning. Dear students, this lecture will be dedicated to anatomy of the autonomic part of the peripheral nervous system, vegetative plexuses. The issues to be addressed in the lecture: the role of the autonomic part of the peripheral nervous system in the human body, sympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system, parasympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system, pathways of the interoceptive analyzer. The autonomic nervous system is also called the vegetative nervous system. It controls the involuntary functions and influences the activity of internal organs. This is why it's also called the visceral nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is a functional division of the nervous system, with its structural parts in both the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Morphologically, the autonomic nervous system is divided into central and peripheral compartments. Functionally, the autonomic nervous system is divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Both the division innervate most of the organs in the body, usually with opposing effects. For example, sympathetic part of autonomic nervous system can accelerate heartbeat, constricts blood vessels, dilates pupils, inhibits salivation, relaxes airways, inhibits peristalsis, constricts sphincters. Conversely, the parasympathetic nervous system promotes a rest and digest response and promotes the following functions like slows heartbeat, dilates blood vessels, constricts pupils, stimulates tear and salivation, constricts airways, activates peristalsis, relaxes sphincters. Neurons of the peripheral autonomic nervous system, which include both the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system, arise from neural crest cells that originate from between the neural and non-neural ectoderm. They form the dorsal neural folds, as the folds themselves form the neural tube. The central part of the autonomic nervous system consists of the centers within the brain, suprasegmental, which are for both sympathetic nervous system and for parasympathetic nervous system, and segmental within the spinal cord for sympathetic nervous system, and for parasympathetic nervous system within brainstem and spinal cord, while the peripheral part is made up of autonomic fibers and ganglia. The sympathetic segmental centers are located within the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar segments of the spinal cord. They are represented with the intermediolateral nucleus, which is related to the spinal segments from the 8th cervical till 2nd lumbar, which is why it's also called the thoracolumbar division. The parasympathetic segmental centers, they lie within the brainstem and in the sacral segments of the spinal cord. Within the brainstem, it will be parasympathetic nuclei of cranial nerve 3rd, 7th, 9th, and 10th. Within the spinal cord, it will be parasympathetic sacral nuclei, which are related to the second sacral segment of the spinal cord, 3rd one sacral segment, and 4th sacral segment, which is why it also called the craniosacral division. The amount of innervation of the sympathetic nervous system is greater than parasympathetic. And only the sympathetic nervous system innervates the sweat glands of the skin, arrector pili muscle, dilator pupille, adrenal medulla, ureter, ductus deferens, seminal glands, ejaculatory duct, muscle of the triangle of the bladder, which prevent the flow of the sperm into the urinary bladder during ejaculation. And only the parasympathetic nervous system innervates the sphincter pupillae, the ciliary muscle, and the trusor muscle. Now we will discuss about the sympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system, which it consists of two compartments, central and peripheral. Like we said a few minutes ago, the central compartment of the sympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system is similar, like for the parasympathetic, it will be suprasegmental centers. So the central compartment is represented with the suprasegmental centers. It will be cortical and subcortical. Cortical will be cerebral cortex of the frontal lobe, limbic lobe, insula. It is not clear whether they are centers controlling and coordinating the activities of relevant parts of the autonomic nervous system, or whether they are only peripheral centers. Similarly, the importance of the brain cortex, which is involved in the control of autonomic functions, lies in the integration and generation of coordinated reflexes associated with the autonomic nervous system. But the main centers within the brain that regulate the autonomic nervous system is the hypothalamus, which is related to the subcortical suprasegmental centers. It receives multiple inputs from other central nuclei, those of the limbic system linked with emotion, the external environment, olfactory mucosa via the medial forebrain bundle, the internal environment via osmoreceptors, thermoreceptors within the hypothalamus, and above the segmental centers, which are also related to the central compartment, because central compartment consists of the suprasegmental centers and segmental. So segmental, like we said a few minutes ago, it was the intermediolateral nucleus, which lies in the lateral horn of the spinal cord from 8 cervical to 2nd, 3rd lumbar segments of the spinal cord. These cell bodies are visceral interoneurons, which is visceral interoneurons. The peripheral compartment of the sympathetic nervous system is represented by ganglia, preganglionic fibers, and postganglionic fibers. Like we said, when we discussed with you about the peripheral part of the sympathetic and parasympathetic centers, we said that this will be fibers, it's made by the fibers, and ganglia. So ganglia, they are essentially a junction between autonomic nerves originating from the central nervous system and autonomic nerves innervating the different organs in the periphery. This is the clusters of neuronal cells body. They are visceral motor neurons. So ganglia, this is gray matter. And preganglionic fibers, this is nerve fibers that connect the central nervous system to ganglia. Postganglionic fibers, this is the fibers from the ganglia to the effector organ. So what are the ganglia of the sympathetic nervous system? The ganglia of sympathetic nervous system, they are divided into the paravertebral and prevertebral. Paravertebral, which lies on the both sides of the vertebral column, which are created the sympathetic chain, which is called sympathetic trunk or truncus sympathicus. And this chain is represented with the ganglia, like cervical ganglia. It will be 3 cervical ganglia, ganglion cervicalis superius, ganglion cervicalis medium, and ganglion cervicalis inferius. It represented with the thoracic 12 ganglia, ganglia thoracica, 5 lumbar ganglia, ganglia lumbalia, 3 fossacral ganglia, ganglia sacralia, and 1 unpaired ganglion impar, which is connected both chain of this sympathetic ganglia. And it will be prevertebral sympathetic ganglia, which lies directly in the sympathetic plexuses which are passes, which are lies directly in the sympathetic plexuses, like aortic, like celiac plexus. It will be celiac ganglion, aorticorenal ganglion. It will be superior mesenteric ganglion, inferior mesenteric ganglion. Also, to the peripheral compartment of the sympathetic nervous system will be related preganglionic fibers. Preganglionic fibers of the sympathetic nervous system, this will be axons of the visceral interneurons, because we said that intermediolateral nucleus is created by the visceral, this is visceral interneurons. So axons of the visceral interneurons of the intermediolateral nucleus, which arise from the anterolateral groove of the spinal cord from 8 cervical segment to second lumbar segment of the spinal cord as a part of anterior root. This is preganglionic fibers. They take place in formation of the spinal nerves, separate out as white rami communicantes albi. Why they are colored? Because they are colored from the shiny white sheath of myelin around each axon, which later connect to two chain ganglia extending alongside the vertebral column on the left and right. So on this picture, green color, this is the color for the preganglionic fibers, which are passes to the sympathetic ganglion, which are create white rami communicantes, which create firstly spinal nerves, and then separate like white communicant branches. So postganglionic fibers. Postganglionic fibers, this is axons of visceral motor neurons, because sympathetic ganglia, we says that this is of the sympathetic trunk, this is visceral motor neurons. Visceral motor neurons of the sympathetic ganglia, so axons of this visceral motor neurons of sympathetic ganglia, this is postganglionic fibers, and they form visceral branches which travel towards the organs, vascular branches which travel with the arteries and form plexuses, gray rami communicantes, which are unmyelinated postganglionic fibers from a sympathetic ganglion to an adjacent spinal nerve. So now we will discuss about the postganglionic fibers of the cervical of the sympathetic trunk. We know that sympathetic trunk is represented with the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and unpaired ganglion. And all postganglionic fibers of these ganglia, they create some nerves. So postganglionic fibers of the cervical ganglia form nervi cardiacis cervicalis, which are responsible for the sympathetic innervation of the heart, rami laryngopharyngeal, which provides sympathetic innervation of the larynx and pharynx. Next nerves, still the rami communicantes grises, they form the plexuses around the vessels. For example, nervus caroticus externus create the plexus in the wall of the arteria carotis externa, and it passes to the organs, those its branches, and supply it. Nervus caroticus internus create the plexus in the wall of the internal carotid artery. Nervus vertebralis is related to the vertebral artery and its branches. Nervus regularis is related to the internal jugular vein and its tributaries. And the last one, postganglionic fibers, it will be rami communicantes grisae, which are joined to the somatic nerves, which are mainly the postganglionic fibers of the cervical ganglia. They are joined to the somatic nerves of the cervical brachial plexus. So this is postganglionic fibers of the cervical ganglia. Now, postganglionic fibers of the thoracic ganglia form nervi cardiaci thoraci, which supply the heart also. We know that provide sympathetic innervation of the heart. We know that sympathetic innervation of the heart responds for the faster heart beating, accelerates the heartbeat. Nervus plantnici, which provides sympathetic innervation of the organ of the thoracic cage. Next to nervus plantnicus major and nervus plantnicus minor, they nothing supply in the thoracic cage. they pass of the diaphragm, and they take place in creation celiac plexus, one of the biggest plexuses or solar plexus in abdominal cavity. And the last postganglionic fibers of the thoracic ganglia, it will be rami communicantes grisae. Rami communicantes grisae, they are joined to the somatic, to the thoracic spinal nerves, are mainly to the intercostal nerve. Postganglionic fibers of the lumbar ganglia form, first of all, one of the biggest plexuses in abdominal cavity. It will be plexus celiacus or solaris. The plexus is formed by the greater and lesser splanchnic nerves, which are the postganglionic fibers of thoracic ganglia. It's created by the postganglionic fibers of the lumbar ganglia, like we said a few minutes ago, sympathetic ganglia of its plexus, and they postganglionic fibers, plus fibers from the anterior and posterior vagal trunk. This celiac plexus, it passes all its branches which are related to the celiac trunk. So this plexus include a number of smaller plexuses. It will be plexus linealis, which supplies spleen, plexus gastricus, which supplies stomach, plexus hepaticus, which is related to the liver, and plexus pancreaticus, which provides the innervation of the sympathetic innervation of the pancreas. The rest plexuses which are lies in abdominal cavity, it will be plexus mesentericus superior, which it passes of all its branches of the same artery, superior mesenteric artery. On this slide, you see, for example, this plexus, which is related to the superior mesenteric artery. And as you see, the superior mesenteric plexus, it supplies small intestine, it supplies second with appendix vermiformis, it supplies ascending colon, transverse colon. The rest plexuses which are related to the abdominal cavity, it will be plexus renalis, plexus suprarenalis, and we know that suprarenal gland, it has sympathetic innervation. Plexus ovaricus in female, plexus testicularis in male, plexus aorticus abdominalis, which create the plexus in aorta, the biggest vessel in the walls of the aorta, in the biggest vessel of our body. This is second one big plexus in abdominal cavity. Next, which is related to it, it will be plexus mesentericus inferior, which also passes of the branches of inferior mesenteric artery and provides a sympathetic innervation of descending colon, sigmoid colon, creates superior rectal plexus, plexus epigastricus superior. Plexus epigastricus superior, this plexus is lies between the bifurcation of aorta. This is unpaired plexus, which is communicate with the inferior hypogastric plexus. And the last postganglionic fibers of lumbar ganglia, they form rami communicantes grisae, except all these plexuses about which we discussed a few minutes ago, which are created by the postganglionic fibers of the lumbar ganglia. Also, postganglionic fibers of lumbar ganglia, they create rami communicantes grisae, which are joined to the lumbar spinal nerves, to the somatic nerves of the lumbar plexus. Now, what about the postganglionic fibers of the sacral ganglia and unpaired ganglia? They form plexus hypogastricus inferior, one of the most important plexuses, the branches of which take place, they create the smallest plexus, which are supply all organs of our pelvis. So, it's also called plexus pelvinus. So, plexus hypogastricus inferior, its branches supply most of organs of the pelvic cavity. So, it's called sometimes plexus pelvinus. What is the plexuses? This will be vesical plexus, rectal plexus, uterovaginal plexus, prostaticus, differentialis, which are prostaticus differentialis, they are related to male. Uterovaginalis is related to female. And the last postganglionic fibers of the sacral ganglia and unpaired ganglia, they form rami communicantes grisae. Rami communicantes grisae, which will be connected to the sacral spinal nerves, to the somatic nerves of the sacral plexus. So now we will discuss with you littlest about the parasympathetic part and its compartment, pars parasympathetica. Parasympathetic part of autonomic nervous system, similar like sympathetic, consists of two compartments, central and peripheral. Like we said a few minutes ago, that the central compartment of the parasympathetic part of autonomic nervous system, similar like for sympathetic, is represented by suprasegmental centers, which are for both cortical and subcortical. And central compartment is also represented with the segmental centers. So suprasegmental, it will be cortical, cerebral cortex of the frontal, limbic lobe, insula, subcortical, diencephalon, which to subcortical will be related diencephalon, and mainly we says it will be hypothalamus. And segmental, this will be the parasympathetic nuclei located in the brainstem and in the sacral segments of the spinal cord. So, what are the parasympathetic nuclei and where they are located? The parasympathetic nuclei of the parasympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system, it will be the nuclei which are lies in the brainstem and related to the cranial nerve, and nuclei which are related to the spinal cord. In the brainstem, it will be the nucleus of Yakubovich or Edinker-Westphal, or like all of you know, it will be accessory nucleus of the oculomotor nerve, nucleus accessorius nervi oculomotori, is the center of the sphincter pupilla. This one nucleus is related to the midbrain and mainly to the tegmentum of the midbrain, which is related to the cerebral crura. The second one nucleus, which also lies in the tegmentum of cerebral crura of the midbrain, it will be the nucleus of Perlia, or unpaired nucleus, nucleus impar of oculomotor nerve. This is the center of accommodation. Also, nucleus Perlia and nucleus Yakubovich, these two parasympathetic nuclei, which are related to the oculomotor nerve or to the third cranial nerve nuclei. Next one nucleus, superior salivatory nucleus, nucleus salivatorius superior, is the nucleus of the intermediate nerve, which is related to the seventh cranial nerve, intermediofascial. Superior salivatory nucleus is related to the tegmentum of the pons, is lies in the tegmentum of the pons. Inferior salivatory nucleus, nucleus salivatorius inferior, is the nucleus of the glossopharyngeal nerve and is related to the medulla oblongata. As you see, superior from the name, superior salivatory nucleus and inferior salivatory nucleus responds for salivation. One of the most important nuclei, which is related to the medulla oblongata, this is the nucleus of our life, or the center of our life, where will be located the center of our life. This will be posterior nucleus of vagus nerve, nucleus dorsalis nervi vagi, which is related to the same triangle of medulla oblongata of the rhomboid fossa. And nucleus dorsalis nervi vagi responds for the circulation of the blood, for the heart beating, for the respiration, digestion, one of the most important nuclei. Sacral parasympathetic nuclei. These nuclei, they are related to this is parasympathetic nuclei, which are related to the spinal cord, to its segment, sacral segments from the second till fourth. Now, peripheral compartment of the parasympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system is represented similar like in the sympathetic with ganglia, preganglionic fibers, and postganglionic fibers. Ganglia of the sympathetic of the parasympathetic nervous system, they have their own name, except the ganglia which are lies in the cavities, because there are a lot of the parasympathetic ganglia, and they are colored like paramural and intramural around of the organ or inside of its walls. So what are the parasympathetic ganglia? The own name will get ciliary ganglion. Ciliary ganglion will be related to the superior orbital fissure. Pterygopalatine ganglion, ganglion pterygopalatinum, which is related to the pterygopalatine fossa. submandibular ganglion, ganglion submandibulare. We know that this one ganglion is related to the submandibular triangle of the neck. Otic ganglion, ganglion oticum. This one ganglion is related to the foramen ovale. And the rest ganglia, paramoral and intramoral, this is the ganglia of the neck, thoracic, abdominal, and pelvic cavities organs. Preganglionic fibers, which are also related to the peripheral compartment. Parasympathetic preganglionic fibers of the parasympathetic nervous system, they are joined to the nerves. So parasympathetic fibers, they will be of the parasympathetic nervous system. It will be parasympathetic fibers of the oculomotor nerve, which are the axons of neurons of the nuclei Yakubovich and Perlia, and end in the terminate in. So postganglionic fibers of oculomotor nerve, they are terminate in the ciliary ganglion, and this will be the axons of the nuclei Yakubovich and Perlia. Greater petrosal nerve also related to the preganglionic fibers. It consists of the axons of the neurons of the superior salivatory nucleus and terminate in pterygopalatine ganglion. Chorda tympani. These preganglionic fibers, it will be axons of neurons of the superior salivatory nucleus, which terminate in submandibular triangle. Leisure petrosal nerve, nervus petrosus minor, consists of axons of neurons of inferior salivatory nucleus and terminate in otic ganglion. Parasympathetic fibers of nervus vagus branches also will be preganglionic fibers, which will be terminate in the intramural and paramural ganglia of the thoracic, abdominal cavity, neck cavity. So the last preganglionic fibers, it will be sacral splantnic nerves, nervis splantnici pelvini. This will be axons of neurons of the parasympathetic nuclei of the sacral segments of the spinal cord, which terminate within the para and intramural ganglia of the pelvic cavity. Now about postganglionic fibers. Postganglionic fibers, like we said, this is axons of visceromotor neurons of parasympathetic ganglia. And postganglionic fibers, they are the fibers of ciliary ganglion. These fibers will innervate sphincter pupilla and ciliary muscle. Postganglionic fibers of pterygopalatine ganglion will innervate lacrimal gland, gland of the nasal cavity, of the palate. The postganglionic fibers of the submandibular ganglion innervate submandibular and sublingual salivary glands, small glands of the oral cavity. Postganglionic fibers of the otic ganglion innervate parotid gland, and postganglionic fibers of the para and intramural innervate organs of the cavities. What is the difference between the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system? Now, first of all, sympathetic system controls the body's fight and flight response. And opposite to it will be parasympathetic, which controls the rest and digest function of the body. Segmental centers of the sympathetic system lies in the spinal cord. It will be intermediolateral nucleus. Segmental centers of the parasympathetic system lies in the brain and spinal cord. It will be parasympathetic nuclei of the cranial nerves and sacral parasympathetic sacral nuclei of the spinal cord. Ganglia of sympathetic nervous system close to the spinal cord and away from innervated organ. Parasympathetic ganglia, they lies within or very close to innervated organ. Preganglionic fiber of the sympathetic system are short, but for parasympathetic will be long, and opposite for postganglionic fibers of the sympathetic system, long, and for the parasympathetic will be short. As you see from this table, you can distinguish its difference. Now we should to discuss with you about the last one question about which we should to discuss today. It means the pathways of the interoceptive analyzer. What about this one question? So the autonomic nervous system does not have its own special afferent sensitive pathway. So interoceptive signals are transmitted to the brain via multiple pathways of the somatic nervous system, which are, if you remember, 4 neurons pathways. But the standard pathways, they will be divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic. What about this ascending pathway of the interoceptive analyzer, which use structure of the afferent pathway of the somatic analyzer? The first one neuron will be located, like we discussed, in sensory ganglion nerve, which gives sensory innervation of organ. Dendrite of it will terminate with receptor in the wall of organ. Axon passed into central nervous system. The second neuron located in sensory nucleus, which gives sensory information to organ. Axon passed to the encephalon. And we know the diencephalon in thalamus will be located. Third neuron, axons of third neuron passes to the cortex, create thalamocortical fibers, which terminate in the cortex. And the last one, fourth neuron, will be located in the cortex, in lamina granularis interna. So this is the example of the scheme for the ascending pathway of the interoceptive analyzer, which use the afferent pathway of the somatic analyzer. Now, what about the sympathetic descending pathway? Sympathetic descending pathway, well, the first one neuron for this one pathway, as you see from this slide, is located in the cortex. Second one will be lies in the encephalon. It will be hypothalamus. Third one will be located in the intermediolateral nucleus, because we know that the segmental center for the sympathetic nervous system lies in the nucleus intermediolaterales of the spinal cord, from the 8th cervical to 2nd lumbar segment. Axons of this third neuron, of this intermediolateral, of this interneurons, they leave spinal cord as a part of anterior root. They create spinal nerves. They out as white rami and terminate in sympathetic ganglia. It will be or sympathetic ganglia of the sympathetic trunk, or it will be prevertebral ganglia. The last one, fourth neuron, will be lies in the ganglion of the sympathetic trunk, in sympathetic ganglia, and axons of which will be passes via the vessels to the organ, or create the ramus communicans grisae and terminate and passes to the organs which it supply. What about the parasympathetic descending pathway? For the parasympathetic system, similar like for the sympathetic, the first one neuron, like we discussed with you, it will be cortex. These impulses from the cortex will be transmitted to the second one neuron, which will be lies in the diencephalon, and like we said for the sympathetic, it will be hypothalamus. Third one neuron will be lies in the parasympathetic nuclei of cranial nerve, which provide parasympathetic nuclei of cranial nerve, or sacral parasympathetic nuclei of the spinal cord. And the last one neuron will be lies in the parasympathetic ganglia, axons of which will be terminate with the effector in the organs. The last one, I want to give you the conclusion for sympathetic and parasympathetic. As you see, the disorders of the autonomic nervous system results in a relatively serious neurological condition. For example, excessive activation of the sympathetic nervous system by emotion, painful stimuli, and drops in blood pressure such as hemorrhagic shock or hypoglycemia trigger a prepared stress response from a body. Chronically increasing sympathetic activity can lead to psychosomatic disorders such as hypertension, type 2 diabetes mellitus, and or gastric ulceration. Hypothalamic disorders can cause damage to thermoregulation, insomnia, premature maturation, growth disturbances, eating disorders like aphagia, hyperphagia, or hormone production disorders. Thank you for listening.